Now let's just back up to the data that illustrate for us the rates of synaptogenesis as indicated by the synaptic density that's found in the cerebral cortex. And I'll highlight now, after this initial dramatic rise in synaptogenesis, that we in each of these cortical areas see a reduction in synaptic density that follows in the subsequent years, well, for humans, for the first decade of life, let's say the second half of that first decade. And so what we see is anywhere from about a 20 to 50% reduction in the numbers of synapses that are found in the adult cerebral cortex compared to this time of peak synaptogenesis, which is probably sometime near the middle of the first decade of life. We think that one consequence of this reduction in the synaptic density in the cerebral cortex is an overall reduction in the volume of gray matter that we see throughout the latter childhood years and through adolescence on into adulthood. Now, here are data that show us gray matter volume obtained from MRI studies, showing data broken down by males and females. The average male brain is larger than the average female brain, so it's not surprising that the average thickness of gray matter of males should be greater than females. But both males and females show essentially the same trend, and that is a reduction in the volume of gray matter throughout the childhood and adolescent years. Again, presumably reflecting not a loss of neurons necessarily, but a loss of synaptic connections. Now again, one can hypothesize that this process might actually be normal and physiological, but it also may go awry in certain developmental disorders. So there are data on this issue from several developmental disorders and cognitive and behavioral dysfunctions. In attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, for example, it appears that not only is there a reduction in the rate of synaptogenesis, but there may be a modest acceleration in the loss of synaptic connections, such that in children with a diagnosis of ADHD, they may end up with a significantly thinner cerebral cortex, again, especially in these frontal executive networks as well as in the temporal lobe, compared to typically developing children. Now, this difference is not great, but it is detectable in cohort studies, and it suggests that there may be something really quite different about the wiring of neural networks in the cerebral cortex of children with this diagnosis. Now, one interesting aspect of brain development throughout these childhood years is that although the volume of gray matter is getting reduced over time, the volume of white matter is actually increasing. And again, this is the case for both men and for women. And there's a lot of activity trying to understand exactly what accounts for this increase in the thickness of white matter. One can reasonably assume that a principal factor is an increase in the myelination of axons in compact white matter pathways that are found within the brain. But there are other possibilities that likely also to contribute, such as an increase in the diameter of axons, potentially even an increase in the numbers of axons that are present in white matter pathways, reflecting ongoing construction of circuits that might continue to take place throughout the first few decades of life. In addition, there may be an increase in the extracellular spaces in this white matter, or an increase in extracellular matrix that would contribute to this overall increase in volume. So these are all open questions, and I'm sure we will learn much more about this in the next couple of years of study. Well, let's now carry on this discussion beyond the first couple of decades of life and look at what happens to overall brain size across the lifespan. As has been now demonstrated in numerous studies, the human brain increases rapidly in the first few years of life, and brain size seems to reach a bit of a plateau somewhere around the beginning of the second decade of life. And then throughout the second and into the third decade, there's not much change. But beginning in about the third decade and beyond, there is a gradual decline in the overall size of the human brain. So again, gray matter is getting smaller rather rapidly towards the end of that first decade, and then into the second decade, whereas white matter is expanding. But by the time of the third or fourth decade, there seems to be a net reduction in both gray matter and white matter volume that continues across the lifespan. There may be some parts of the brain that are changing more rapidly than others, perhaps some white matter pathways that are changing more rapidly than others. One common idea in cognitive neuroscience is that the white matter of the frontal lobe is the last region of white matter to become fully myelinated or to achieve its full volume. But it may also be the part of the cerebral white matter that is the first to show reductions in white matter volume, perhaps reflecting a loss of myelin or disordering of myelin that continues across the lifespan with increasing rate of disruption of myelin with advanced age. Again, further topics that require much more study for us to fully understand exactly what's going on with the aging brain. Now, one last point that I would make about this decline in brain size is that it seems fairly clear that this reduction in overall brain size is not due to a loss of neurons, but rather through these kinds of reductions in myelin and reductions in the numbers of synapses in gray matter that lead us to hypothesize that there is a reduction in the connectivity of the brain rather than the numbers of neurons per se. If neurons are being lost, then we attribute that to a neurodegenerative pathology. So this is a bit of a changing concept in aging neuroscience, where we now typically understand that the loss of neurons is pathological and should not be considered part of normal aging.